The universe is ancient, far older than we can truly comprehend. It has seen civilizations rise to unimaginable heights, only to crumble into dust and be forgotten. Some ruled for millions of years, their empires stretching across the stars, like great cosmic titans. Others burned bright and fast, leaving behind only the ruins of their ambition. But among all these species, in all their long histories, none had ever encountered anything like us. Humanity wasn't supposed to matter. We weren't special. We weren't even considered a threat. And that was their first mistake. The war that changed everything, the war that made humanity the most feared species in the universe, didn't begin with a declaration, or a battle, or even a warning. It began with arrogance. The Xanar Dominion had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war. They had fought and conquered countless species, each time refining their tactics, each time perfecting the most efficient way to erase a civilization from existence. To them, war wasn't a struggle. It was a process. A simple formula: find a weaker species, overwhelm them, eliminate resistance, and absorb whatever resources remained. It had always worked. There was no reason to believe Earth would be any different. At first, we didn't even know they existed. We had been reaching out to the stars, sending signals, dreaming of contact. But the universe is not a kind place. When they found us, they didn't announce themselves with messages of peace. There were no attempts at diplomacy, no warnings, no offers of surrender. The Xanar didn't negotiate. They didn't see the point. One day the sky simply changed. A fleet unlike anything we had ever imagined appeared in orbit, blotting out the stars. The first attack was precise, methodical. They didn't simply bomb us into oblivion. That would have been a waste. They cut us off. First, they took our satellites, blinding our communication networks. Then, they destroyed our orbital stations, silencing our ability to escape. Our defenses, pitiful as they were eliminated in minutes. The first city fell within an hour. It was unlike anything humanity had ever faced. These weren't just invaders. They weren't here to rule over us. They weren't here to enslave us or exploit us. They were here to wipe us out, efficiently and cleanly, just as they had done to hundreds of other worlds before. And at first, it seemed like they would succeed. They struck with terrifying precision, using technology so far beyond our own that we might as well have been cavemen throwing spears at gods. Governments collapsed within days. The militaries of the world, designed for wars against each other, were completely outmatched. Cities were turned into graveyards. And yet, the Xanar didn't finish the job. That was their second mistake. Because they didn't understand us. They had conquered species before. They had faced resistance before. But in all their long history, they had never encountered a species like humanity. They believed war was a simple equation: firepower, numbers, strategy. But for us, war was never just about survival. It was personal. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. The Xanar had been expecting a short campaign. They had expected the same pattern they had seen countless times before. Initial resistance, followed by surrender, followed by complete annihilation. They didn't realize that surrender was never an option for us. They didn't realize that, when humans are backed into a corner, when we have nothing left to lose, we don't just resist, we become something else. The first counterattacks were small. Scattered survivors, armed with whatever they could find, striking at the edges of the occupation. Ambushes, sabotage. They barely slowed the Xanar down. At eyesight, first, it must have seemed like nothing more than an annoyance, an expected part of the process. But then, it started spreading. Humanity adapted. Fast. We learned their weaknesses, their tactics, their routines. We scavenged their technology, using it in ways they had never considered. We turned cities into battlegrounds, ruins into fortresses, darkness into a weapon. We fought like nothing they had ever faced. Because unlike the species they had conquered before, we didn't play by the rules. The Xanar believed in precision. We believed in chaos. The Xanar followed strict doctrine. We improvised. The Xanar expected us to break. Instead, we hardened. The war should have ended in weeks. Instead, it became something else, something far worse. The Xanar had come to exterminate us. But in doing so, they had created something they could no longer control, because they had given us a reason to become the very thing they feared most. The first mistake the Xanar made was underestimating us. The second was assuming we would break. But their greatest mistake, the one that would doom them, was giving us time. In every other conquest, resistance collapsed quickly. Fear spread like a disease, paralyzing the populations they attacked. Panic led to surrender. Surrender led to extermination. It was a pattern that had repeated for thousands of years, and the Xanar believed it would happen again. But humanity. We don't break the way other species do. Our history is written in fire and blood. We've endured wars, plagues, and disasters that should have wiped us out. Yet we've always survived. The moment the Xanar landed on Earth, they had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. At first, it looked like we were doing exactly what they expected: scattered resistance, doomed attempts at fighting back. They had wiped out most of our militaries in the first few days, their orbital superiority making any large-scale counterattack impossible. Governments struggled to maintain order, and most of the world's leadership either went into hiding or fell in the chaos. The Xanar saw this as confirmation that we were just like every other species they had destroyed, but what they didn't understand was that humanity thrives in chaos. When civilization collapsed, we didn't stop fighting. We got better at it. We weren't bound by strict hierarchies or rigid battle doctrines. We didn't need centralized command structures. From the ruins of our cities, new kinds of warfare emerged, not from generals, but from ordinary people who refused to die quietly. Survivors learned fast. At first, they fought in disorganized cells, ambushing patrols with whatever weapons they could find. But as weeks passed, those cells became networks. Isolated resistance groups began communicating, coordinating. And then, something even more dangerous happened. The surviving soldiers, those who had been cut off from command, those who had nothing left to lose, started teaching. Special forces operatives, insurgency experts, and guerrilla fighters began training civilians, passing down their knowledge like wildfire. What started as desperate attacks turned into calculated strikes. What had been scattered groups turned into something terrifying: organized resistance. And then came the scavengers. At first, humans had been limited to our own weapons, which were primitive compared to Xanar technology. But the more battles we fought, the more of their weapons we stole. At first, we just used them crudely, turning their own rifles against them. But soon, engineers, scientists, and hackers, once office workers, students, and researchers, began figuring out how they worked. Within months, we were modifying their weapons, improving them, creating hybrid technology that even the Xanar hadn't considered possible. But the real turning point came when we started hacking their systems. Xanar technology was superior in every way, except one. They had never needed to worry about electronic warfare. In all their past conquests, no species had ever been able to match their coding, their security, their automated systems. But humanity had spent decades, centuries, building the most advanced cyber warfare capabilities ever seen on Earth. And now, that expertise was being turned against an enemy that had never encountered anything like it before. Suddenly, their patrol drones stopped working. Their targeting systems glitched at the worst possible moments. Their supply chains broke down as their own logistics networks were hijacked. And in the dead of night, entire Xanar outposts went dark, their automated defenses shutting down without explanation, right before human strike teams moved in. It was the first time in their history that the Xanar faced an enemy that didn't just resist them, but adapted faster than they could react, and they started to panic. Their response was brutal. The Xanar had always believed in overwhelming force, but now, they escalated to total annihilation. They began wiping out entire cities, not just strategic targets, but any location suspected of harboring resistance. Millions died. They believed it would break us. Instead, it united us. Humanity had always fought each other. We had spent our entire history divided, by nations, by politics, by ideologies. But the moment the Xanar started burning our world, all of that vanished. There were no more countries, no more factions. There was only one goal: survival. And that was the moment when we stopped being prey and became something else. The Xanar were learning a terrible lesson, one that no species had ever taught them before. A cornered animal fights. A desperate species resists. But humanity, we don't just fight back. We evolve. We escalate. We turn every horror inflicted upon us into fuel for something far worse. The war was no longer about survival. It was about something else now. It was about vengeance. The moment humanity stopped fighting for survival and started fighting for vengeance, the war changed. Until now, the Xanar had believed they were in control. Their fleet still dominated Earth's skies. Their war machines still patrolled our ruined cities, and their soldiers still enforced their brutal order. But something was different. They had expected resistance to weaken over time, to crumble as hope faded. Instead, it was growing stronger. The longer the war dragged on, the more humanity adapted, and the more impossible it became to stop us. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. The Xanar had always won through overwhelming force, but force alone wasn't working. They had been trained to fight enemies who followed predictable patterns, who surrendered when faced with annihilation. Humanity wasn't playing by their rules. We turned their strengths against them. We weren't just fighting the Xanar on battlefields. We were fighting them in ways they had never encountered before. We began targeting their supply lines, their infrastructure, their command networks. Sabotage became our greatest weapon. If the Xanar occupied a city, we poisoned their water supply. If they set up a command center, it was rigged to explode the moment they relaxed. They had the advantage in firepower, but we had something even more dangerous: unpredictability. And then we started learning their tactics. Captured Xanar soldiers were interrogated relentlessly, not just by military experts, but by psychologists, behavioral analysts, and even former criminals who knew how to break someone without leaving a mark. Every captured Xanar was a treasure trove of information. We learned how they thought, how they made decisions, how their officers structured their battle plans, but it went beyond that. The Xanar had always believed that their technology would keep them safe, that their security systems, their encrypted communications, and their automated defenses were beyond any threat. But humanity had something they had never accounted for: hackers. Our best minds worked day and night, cracking their codes, rewriting their software, and turning their own war machines against them. Xanar drones meant to patrol occupied territories suddenly stopped responding. Their battlefield AI, designed to coordinate attacks, began feeding them false information. And then came the first real turning point. Somewhere deep in the ruins of what had once been a thriving metropolis, a group of scavengers stumbled upon something unexpected: an intact Xanar command relay. It was meant to be a secure network hub, a critical piece of their communication web. The Xanar never expected it to be breached. But in less than a week, human engineers had taken control of it. And then, we started listening. For the first time, we had access to their internal communications. We heard their reports, their movements, their weaknesses. But more than that, we heard their fear. The Xanar had never lost a war. They had never even faced serious resistance. And now, for the first time, their commanders were arguing. Their leadership was in disarray. They had the superior technology, the superior numbers, the superior firepower, but none of it was working. Because humans don't fight fair. The next wave of our attacks wasn't just random strikes or desperate sabotage. They were coordinated assaults based on real-time intelligence. Resistance groups in different parts of the world, once isolated from each other, began working together, striking at key locations at the exact moments when Xanar defenses were weakest. Then, the next phase of our war began. We stopped hiding. The Xanar had always assumed that once they controlled Earth's skies, the war was effectively over. No species had ever been able to fight back without space superiority, but humanity had never needed control of the skies to win wars before. Our ancestors had fought from the shadows, from jungles, from mountains, from deserts. Now, we were doing the same thing, on a planetary scale. The cities they had taken became killing grounds. Streets were littered with traps, buildings collapsed on entire platoons. Underground tunnels allowed resistance fighters to appear out of nowhere and disappear just as fast. The Xanar controlled the surface, but humanity controlled everything beneath it. And then, we turned the war psychological. Captured Xanar soldiers were released, but not before being forced to witness horrors beyond anything they had imagined. We made them watch as their own weapons were used against them. We let them see how we had turned their technology into instruments of destruction more terrifying than anything they had designed. And then, we let them go. Alive, but broken. The Xanar had never encountered psychological warfare before. They had never needed it. But now, their soldiers were terrified. They refused to patrol certain areas. They second-guessed their orders. Rumors spread through their ranks like wildfire. They believed humans had discovered something unnatural, something beyond their understanding. But the truth was much simpler. We had simply become better at war than they had ever imagined possible. And then, we built something new. The first hybrid weapons, human ingenuity fused with Xanar technology, began appearing on the battlefield. Energy rifles modified for human hands, Xanar drones reprogrammed to fight against their own creators, stolen, vehicles with Earth-based AI running their systems. We weren't just using their weapons anymore. We were improving them. The Xanar knew they were losing control, and so, they made one final, desperate decision. They called for reinforcements. A second invasion fleet, twice the size of the first, was already on its way. If it reached Earth, all of our victories would mean nothing. Every resistance fighter, every stolen weapon, every battle won, it would all be wiped away in an instant. The new fleet carried enough firepower to burn the entire planet to ash. Humanity had one chance. We had to stop them before they arrived. The Xanar reinforcements were coming. A second invasion fleet, twice the size of the first, carrying enough firepower to glass Earth entirely, was already en route. If it arrived, everything we had fought for would be erased. The resistance would be crushed, our people exterminated, and our planet reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale for any species foolish enough to resist the Xanar in the future. We had one chance. We couldn't fight them in orbit. We didn't have a fleet of our own. Our planetary defenses had been shattered in the first invasion, and the Xanar still held control of Earth's skies. But we had something far more dangerous than warships. We had desperation. And desperation fuels innovation. For months, scientists, engineers, and hackers had been working in secret, modifying captured Xanar technology. We had learned how their ships operated, how their FTL drives functioned, how their navigation systems were designed. More importantly, we had learned how their fleet communicated, how their ships relayed information between each other, how their command structures were formed. And we had an advantage the Xanar still didn't understand. They believed themselves to be superior in every way. Their technology was more advanced, their military experience vast. But the one thing they had never encountered before, the thing they never prepared for, was an enemy that could think like them, and better. It started with a single stolen Xanar warship. A scout vessel, small but fast, recovered from the wreckage of an ambush. Resistance engineers worked around the clock, stripping out its security failsafes, reprogramming its systems, and adapting its interface for human control. It was a miracle of reverse engineering, an alien craft running on human ingenuity. And then, a second warship fell into our hands, and a third. Each one was modified, repurposed, turned into a weapon that the Xanar would never see coming. We couldn't build a fleet of our own, but we could steal one. And the moment we had enough ships to execute a plan, we launched our most audacious attack yet. The Xanar controlled Earth's skies, but they had grown complacent. Their orbital security relied on automated systems and predictable patrol routes. They weren't expecting an attack, not from space and certainly not from their own ships. But that's exactly what they got. The first strike came from within their own ranks. A Xanar supply ship suddenly veered off course, slamming into a defense station in low orbit, crippling its sensors. At the same moment, a Xanar cruiser received false orders to reroute its fleet movements, leaving a critical gap in their planetary defense net. And then, we moved in. The stolen warships, piloted by human crews, slipped through the gaps, disguised as friendly vessels. The Xanar had no idea they were under attack until it was too late. By the time they realized their own ships were turning against them, Earth's resistance had already hijacked their orbital relays, flooding their network with false signals, jamming communications, and sending contradictory commands to their fleet. For the first time since the war began, the Xanar lost control of Earth's orbit. But that wasn't the real objective. The second invasion fleet was still coming. We couldn't stop it with stolen ships alone, but we could do something far worse. We could trick them. Using their own relay stations, we sent a single carefully coded transmission straight to the incoming fleet, a distress signal, encrypted with Xanar military protocols, carrying a message that would change the course of the war forever. The humans have acquired advanced weaponry. Fleet 1 has suffered catastrophic losses. Do not approach. Earth is a death trap. Turn back immediately. The Xanar were arrogant, but they weren't reckless. They had spent thousands of years conquering weaker civilizations, and they had never encountered a species that could pose a real threat. If the first invasion force had truly been wiped out, if humanity had somehow acquired technology capable of destroying them, then sending reinforcements wasn't just dangerous, it was suicide. For hours, the second invasion fleet hesitated. Their commanders debated. They scanned the relay stations for confirmation. They tried to reach their forces already on Earth, forces that we had jammed into silence. Every piece of information they received reinforced one terrifying conclusion. The Xanar had walked into a trap, and then, something happened that had never occurred in their empire's history. They retreated. The second invasion fleet, twice the size of the first, armed with enough firepower to annihilate Earth, turned around and fled. They didn't come to rescue their stranded forces. They didn't come to finish the war. They left. For the first time, the Xanar had encountered a species too dangerous to conquer. But for those still on Earth, the nightmare was just beginning. The Xanar forces left behind had just realized that their reinforcements weren't coming. They were stranded, trapped on a world filled with enemies who were no longer fighting for survival. Enemies who were now hunting them. Humanity had turned the war. Now, it was time for retribution. The moment the second invasion fleet turned back, the war changed forever. The Xanar forces still on Earth, once the unstoppable conquerors of humanity, were now abandoned, isolated, and completely surrounded. They had come expecting to rule. Now they were prey. At first, they didn't believe it. The Xanar were an empire that had never lost a war, never suffered a true defeat. Their officers assured their soldiers that this was a temporary setback, that reinforcements would return, that this was merely a strategic retreat. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The Empire had abandoned them. The Xanar had determined that Earth was too dangerous to hold. Panic spread through their ranks. Their entire war doctrine was built on the assumption of superior force. Overwhelming numbers, unbreakable supply lines, and absolute control of the battlefield. Without those things, their discipline started to fracture. And that's when humanity struck. Before, we had been fighting for survival. Now, we were hunting. The war shifted from direct engagements to something far more terrifying. Systematic extermination. The Xanar controlled the skies, but we controlled the ground, and we used it against them. It started with ambushes. Small, Xanar patrols, once the hunters, began vanishing without a trace. Supply convoys sent to reinforce defensive positions simply never arrived. Their command stations received distorted distress signals, but when reinforcements arrived, they found only empty streets and the remnants of a battle that had already ended. The Xanar were technologically superior, but we had learned how to use their own technology against them. We had studied their weapons, dissected their armor, understood how their battlefield AI made decisions. And then, we began feeding that AI false information, ghost signals that led Xanar forces into carefully laid traps, coordinates that sent their troops straight into ambush zones. Their war machines, once symbols of their invincibility, became liabilities. Xanar battle drones, originally designed to patrol occupied zones, were hijacked and turned against their former masters. Their exosuits, built to withstand any environment, became coffins when we figured out how to disrupt their oxygen supply. Their tanks, seemingly indestructible, were turned into death traps when resistance fighters planted explosives in the very roads they traveled. But the most terrifying part wasn't the technology. It was the psychological warfare. The Xenar had never fought an enemy that truly understood fear. They had always relied on intimidation, on the knowledge that resistance was futile. But humanity? We understood fear better than any species they had ever encountered. We didn't just use it, we weaponized it. We let captured Xenar soldiers escape, just to let them spread stories of what they had seen. Of patrols that had disappeared into the darkness. Of entire bases that had been wiped out overnight. Of enemy fighters who never revealed themselves until it was too late. They started seeing things that weren't there. They hesitated before stepping into buildings, afraid that every door was booby-trapped. They panicked at every flicker of movement, convinced that death was waiting just beyond the shadows. And the worst part? They were right. Xenar officers tried to maintain control. They executed deserters. They enforced stricter discipline. But it didn't matter. Fear had already taken hold. And then, we gave them a choice: surrender, or be hunted. At first, the Xenar refused. Their pride wouldn't allow them to accept defeat. They fortified their last strongholds, determined to fight to the bitter end. But then, something happened that shattered what little morale they had left. We started taking their officers. Not killing them, taking them. Vanishing without a trace. One by one, high-ranking Xenar commanders were captured in the dead of night, plucked from their fortified bunkers, dragged from their command posts. The Xenar woke up to find their leaders gone, their chains of command shattered. And then, we sent the officers back, not as leaders, not as soldiers, but as broken, hollow shells of what they once were. Whatever they had seen, whatever had been done to them, had turned them into something unrecognizable. They didn't speak. They didn't resist. They simply sat, staring into nothing, whispering in their own language. Whispers of horrors their soldiers couldn't comprehend. That was the final straw. The Xenar didn't just surrender. They begged for mercy. They dropped their weapons, abandoned their posts, and turned themselves over to humanity, willingly. They didn't ask for negotiations, didn't request prisoner of war protections. They simply wanted to survive. But we weren't feeling merciful. For years, we had suffered under their rule. We had watched our cities burn, our people slaughtered, our planet turned into a battlefield. Now, it was their turn to understand what that felt like. Mass executions followed. Xenar prisoners were lined up and shot. Entire divisions were marched into the wastelands and left to die. The lucky ones were killed quickly. The unlucky ones were left to the survivors of humanity. The civilians who had lived through the occupation, who had lost everything, who had no interest in showing kindness. But we didn't kill them all. Some we left alive. Not out of pity, but for a far more sinister reason. We needed messengers. We sent them back to the Xenar Empire, not as prisoners, but as warnings. We let them go free, let them return to their homeworlds, let them tell their people exactly what had happened to them. We wanted the Xenar to know what we were capable of, because this wasn't just about Earth anymore. This war had started as an invasion. But now it was something else entirely. It was a reckoning. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival. We were fighting to make sure this never happened again. The Xenar had made a fatal mistake when they chose to invade Earth. Because now we weren't just survivors, we were conquerors, and the war wasn't over yet. The war on Earth was over. The Xenar, once the proud rulers of 1,000 conquered worlds, had been utterly broken. Their occupation force, abandoned by their empire, had been hunted, eradicated, or sent back as warnings. But for humanity, this wasn't victory. Not yet. We had survived. But survival wasn't enough. Because we knew something the Xenar didn't. Something they had failed to understand in their arrogance. When you try to exterminate a species, when you try to wipe them out, erase their history, burn their cities, you don't just create an enemy, you create a nightmare. And now, it was humanity's turn to bring that nightmare to the stars. For the first time in our history, we were unified. Not as warring nations, not as fractured governments, but as one species with a singular goal: vengeance. We had no fleet, no colonies, no interstellar infrastructure, but we had something far more terrifying than that. We had nothing left to lose, and that made us unstoppable. The first target wasn't the Xanar homeworld. That would come later. No. Our first move was something far more calculated, something far more terrifying to them. We hit their supply chains. The Xanar Empire was vast. They ruled entire star systems, maintained military outposts on hundreds of planets, relied on a network of trade routes and automated shipping lines to sustain their war machine. And that war machine depended on predictability. It depended on stability. It depended on the assumption that no species could challenge their authority. That assumption was wrong. Humanity had no warships, so we took theirs. We had no interstellar bases, so we seized theirs. We had no fleet, so we turned their own trade routes into hunting grounds. Xanar cargo ships began vanishing in the void. At first, it was subtle. Delays in shipments, missing transports, distress beacons that flickered for a moment before going silent. Then, it escalated. Entire convoys disappeared without a trace. Xanar Command sent warships to investigate. Those warships never returned. Humanity wasn't fighting like an empire. We weren't launching massive invasions, weren't engaging in drawn-out battles. No. We fought like something else entirely. We fought like predators. We learned to strike from the shadows to attack where the Xanar were weakest. We raided their colonies, dismantled their outposts, turned their own logistics against them. When their soldiers landed to secure a planet, they found nothing but scorched ruins, factories sabotaged, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies contaminated. They started to starve. And then, we gave them a message. We didn't negotiate. We didn't ask for peace. We simply sent a single terrifying warning to every Xanar-controlled world. You should have killed us all. The Xanar didn't understand. This had never happened before. In their long history of conquest, every species they had encountered had fallen in line. Even the ones that had resisted eventually surrendered. But humanity? We didn't just resist. We became something they couldn't comprehend. We became an existential threat. And so, the Xanar High Council made a decision. A final, desperate attempt to end the war before it spiraled out of their control. They would erase Earth from existence. It was a scorched Earth strategy, the kind they had never needed before. The Xanar would gather the full might of their empire, assemble a doomsday fleet of unimaginable firepower, and launch a single, overwhelming strike against humanity's homeworld. They wouldn't just invade this time. They wouldn't occupy. They wouldn't take prisoners. They would obliterate Earth. A fleet was assembled, larger than any the Xanar had deployed in millennia. Thousands of warships, planetary annihilation weapons, artificial moons designed to crack a world's crust and reduce it to molten slag. They thought this would end humanity, but they still didn't understand what they were dealing with, because while they were assembling their fleet, we were already inside their homeworld. The Xanar were an empire built on control. Their home planet, Xanar Prime, was the center of it all. A jewel of towering spires, orbital rings, vast networked megacities. It had never seen war, never known invasion. It was protected by the most advanced defense systems in the galaxy, safeguarded by fleets of elite warriors. And yet, by the time the Xanar Doomsday Fleet was ready to launch, it was already too late. The first sign was subtle, a systems glitch. Nothing major, just a minor malfunction in their planetary defense grid. Then, an energy spike in their orbital surveillance network. Then, the lights went out. In an instant, every orbital defense station, every planetary shield, every automated war system designed to protect Xanar Prime shut down. And then, the bombs started going off. Humanity had never needed a fleet. We never needed an armada. Because while the Xanar had been preparing for war in the stars, we had already won the war on the ground. Xanar Prime was burning. Sabotage, infiltration, cyber warfare. We had turned their own technology against them, the same way we had done on Earth. Their leaders, those who had ordered our genocide, those who had abandoned their own soldiers to die, were suddenly cut off, helpless, trapped in their own cities as the night sky erupted in flames, and then, in the heart of their capital, the humans revealed themselves. We had been there for months, waiting, planning, preparing, and now, when the Xanar were at their most vulnerable, we struck. The Xanar's ruling elite were dragged from their fortresses, pulled from their luxurious towers, their grand halls of power. The very same mercy they had denied humanity was now denied to them. There were no negotiations, no trials, no offers of surrender. Humanity didn't just conquer Xanar Prime. We erased it. And as the last screams of the Xanar leadership were broadcast, across their empire the message was clear. The war was over. Humanity had won. But it wasn't just a victory. It was a warning to every species in the universe. The Xanar had made humanity suffer, and in doing so, they had created something new, something terrifying, something unstoppable. We weren't just another conquered race. We weren't just another civilization to be absorbed into an empire. We were something else. We were the monsters in the dark, the hunters of hunters, the species that had turned extinction into a weapon and vengeance into an art form. And from that moment forward, humanity was no longer seen as weak, no longer seen as prey. From that moment forward, we were the most feared species in the universe. The war was over, but its echoes would be felt across the universe for eternity. The Xanar Empire, the greatest force the galaxy had ever known, was shattered, not by another empire, not by superior technology, but by the very species they had tried to erase. Humanity had not just survived. We had ascended. The Xanar homeworld, once the heart of an empire spanning thousands of worlds, was now a ruin, a silent, smoldering reminder of what happened to those who underestimated us. Their fleets, once unmatched in firepower, had been either destroyed or seized by human forces. Their colonies, once symbols of their dominance, had fallen into chaos. Without their ruling elite, without their vast military machine to maintain order, the Xanar species fragmented. Civil wars erupted. Planets that had once cowered under their rule saw an opportunity for freedom, and they took it. The empire collapsed, but humanity did not. For the first time in history, we weren't fighting for survival. We weren't clawing our way back from the brink of extinction. We were something else entirely now. We were a conquering force, and the galaxy knew it. The surviving Xanar who had fled to other worlds whispered warnings to anyone who would listen. The other interstellar civilizations, many of whom had once seen humanity as insignificant, primitive, beneath notice, now watched in terror. Because we had done something no species had ever done before. We had fought an empire and won. Not through superior firepower, not through diplomacy, but through sheer, relentless, merciless determination. And that made us dangerous. At first, the other galactic powers tried to pretend it hadn't happened. They issued weak, meaningless statements condemning the unnecessary destruction of Xanar Prime. They debated among themselves whether humanity had gone too far. But behind closed doors, they were terrified. Because if humanity had been able to destroy an empire like the Xanar, what could we do to them? So, they tried to contain us. They sent emissaries, not as conquerors, but as cowards. They came with treaties, with desperate offers to welcome humanity into the galactic community. They tried to set rules, establish limits, create new laws to prevent another Xanar-like disaster. They thought we would agree. They thought we would submit. They thought we would forget. But we didn't. Humanity had learned a lesson written in fire and blood. We had learned that the universe was not a place of peace. It was not a place of fairness, of coexistence, of diplomacy. It was a battleground, a place where only the strong survived, and we had become the strongest. So we did not bow, we did not kneel. Instead, we did something the other species had never expected. We expanded. The fleets we had stolen, the technology we had adapted, the war machine we had built, we turned it outward. The galaxy had always belonged to the great empires, to the old powers that had ruled uncontested for millennia. But now, it belonged to us. We did not start another war. We did not launch another conquest. We didn't need to, because the universe had already seen what happened when humanity was pushed too far. They had seen what we were capable of. And that fear, that deep, instinctive terror, was more powerful than any weapon. The same species that had once dismissed us as weak now spoke our name in hushed tones. When human ships entered a star system, there were no demands, no ultimatums. The mere presence of our forces was enough. Entire planets surrendered without a fight. Not because we forced them to, but because they knew. What would happen if they didn't? Humanity had become more than a species, more than a civilization. We had become a force of nature, and the galaxy understood something that the Xanar had failed to grasp until it was too late. Humanity was not to be conquered. Humanity was not to be controlled. Humanity was to be feared, and so, as our fleets spread across the stars, as our influence expanded into every corner of the cosmos, a new order emerged. Not an empire, not a republic. Something far more terrifying. A warning. A silent, unspoken truth that every species in the universe now understood. Never make an enemy of humanity. Because if you do, there will be no mercy. There will be no negotiations. There will only be extinction. And that concludes the story. Humanity went from prey to predator, from victim to conqueror, and the galaxy would never be the same again. But what do you think? Did humanity go too far? Or was this the only way to ensure our survival? Let us know in the comments. And if you love deep, thrilling stories about humanity's rise among the stars, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join the growing HFY Chronicles-849 community. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories to life. Until next time, stay curious, stay fearless, and remember, humanity always finds a way.